to the Brandon Joe podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Jesse Michel. He received both his Master in Arts in Counseling and his PhD in Sport and Exercise Psychology from the West Virginia University. Is currently a performance psychologist at Deloitte and the owner of Mindset for Excellence. Welcome, Jesse. Thanks for joining us today.
All right. Thanks for having me, Joe. And Brandon, nice to meet you. I don't know what a sports psych guy can bring to an IO psych community, but we're going to do our best, okay?
No, that's the best thing about IO. We get all walks of
Best
life.
part.
Okay, great.
No, we're excited because you have a really cool background. I didn't even mention it in the intro, but you worked for the Houston Astros, right?
I did. I worked for the Astros for 5 years. I've done a lot of work with military doing high performance and performance psychology programs and curriculum development and program implementation. I've worked for Deloitte for a couple of years and have done some work with Olympic athletes and international athletes and collegiate athletes, and have been very fortunate in my career to have dipped my toe in a few different spaces. So
No, that's really cool. That's like how do you even get started in something like that? Because that's like it's I feel like it's almost like niche. Like you really got to seek something out to like work in like that sort of sports field. That
yeah, so how do you get started? You get started because you think you're a decent athlete, and then you reach a point where you're no longer good enough to play, and then everything starts spiraling downhill, and you realize you were nowhere near as, quote, mentally tough, quote, unquote, as you thought you were. And then you go on some path to self-discovery to figure out your true purpose. So that's how you get started, and then you end up here 20 years later. I see somebody raising
Oh
their
my
hand
gosh.
on the other side of the
Yep.
screen. So perhaps one of you and those that are listening can identify.
I'm looking in a mirror, it sounds like. This looks great. I'm
Yeah.
excited.
hmm
No, that's awesome though. I know you said what can you provide, but it's really funny. We were talking with you about this before we started filming. Joe and I at PsyOp got to listen to the intersection of sports psychology and IO psychology. So it's definitely something that's top of mind for us. It's something that's really cool. Do you get to interact with we've mentioned some like similar names that we all know, like do you get to interact with like basic IO psychology principles if you've heard of them, or like what is your knowledge of IO psychology?
Yeah. So my knowledge of IO psychology is very limited. I'm fairly certain if you gave me a list of 20 theories, I could probably find some threads with some other areas of psychology. But no, I've never admittedly taken an IO class. I've worked with some IO psychologists, so probably through osmosis or something like that, I've learned a little bit. But no, I'm an IO newbie.
Oh, that's great. It's a good thing to be on the podcast that we can converse. But then I guess we can keep going with that with your degree then. So your PhD was in sport and exercise psychology. Is do you still use some of that stuff that you learned in your degree today? Is it like transferable to the consulting realm?
Yeah, it's definitely transferable. I think there's whether it's IO or performance psychology or you pick a psychology subdiscipline. I think we would all agree there's probably at least a bit of overlap in some of the theory and the science around what drives people to do what they do, and then you figure out the specific setting, right? I'm going to jump to a conclusion here that in the IO space, there's a lot around uh, environments and organizations and teams and sort of what is the psychology of behavior at the wide group level and at the the industry level. But whether it's a team of consultants or whether it's a team of collegiate basketball players or whether it's a team of special operators, they're humans at the end of the day. So it's about trying to figure out what does this uh, theory or what does the science behind this concept look like with this group. And what I know this is you had mentioned before we hopped on the call that many of the folks that listen could be students. And I just want to, a quick disclaimer that the jump between what you read in the book and what you find in the real world is quite the gap. And it's nothing that like, you can really prepare for other than getting reps under your belt, but you're talking about sort of like, theory to application. And regardless of what space you're in, I think there's going to be that learning curve. But you hope that you have a good foundation of the science to be able to make sense of the application. You were talking about like which aspects of my education might show up. So specifically as it pertains to consulting, whether I'm working with a soldier getting ready to go out in a training mission or getting ready to go out, to battle, whether I'm working with a Major League Baseball player who's about to start a season, or maybe after the All-Star break has not had the season that they want, or whether it's working with a consultant or a partner to try and figure out how to get themselves or their teams mentally ready to go give a presentation, or improve communication with their team, or create a better environment where folks can leverage their strengths in a more meaningful way, and approach the work with a bit more deliberately and a bit more clearly and confidently. You think about like what are the most important psychosocial emotional factors as it pertains to performance. I think a lot about like decision making under duress, being able to manage energy, throughout sort of the cycle of a project or a week, being able to navigate really team dynamics, and in a consulting environment, those can be quite thick. Being able to interact appropriately with clients and be able to sort of manage yourself in the moment to be present, and to have the skills, the psychosocial emotional skills to show up every day. So that's just a little bit of how I would think about applying those same principles.
It's interesting when you say that too, because the application, as you said, is going to look a little different than when you read it straight out of a textbook. Um, there's a crazy intersection that I don't know, Joe, if you picked up on it. Like I mentioned, that psyop talk that we listened to. A lot of people who work in sports psychology work with like the military, work with organizations, and work with sports teams. And I just think that's so interesting that like there is some similarities there. And I think that it picks up on what you were alluding to there, Jesse. Like there are people who are going to have certain mentalities or different ways of doing things. And you can try and find the transfer of that in all of those different disciplines. One question I have for you is like, when you've been doing your work, what are the differences you've seen across those different, like, I guess you would call them industries or areas of focus?
Yeah, perhaps that is where some of the IO concepts might show up, is in the differences, meaning the difference in environment walking into, let's say, working with a brigade or a company, with the military, or walking into uh, a leading a workshop for first year professional baseball players, or you know collegiate athletes who are juniors and seniors, versus a conversation with partners and principals, right? That we lead one of the groups I lead, at Deloitte, is for new partners and principals, sort of a space for them to get together and talk through some of these concepts, right? Those the dynamics and the culture and the context and sort of the stuff between is so different, and those are just like five groups of 5,000 possible groups one could walk into when delivering this, versus have done a lot of work individually with, let's say, a soldier or a baseball player, or somebody in business, or a golfer or a swimmer. Those conversations and that work, when you're trying to work with them one on one, are much different. And then on top of that, you have to help them figure out, okay, well, we've done this work solo. How am I going to bring this back? Because it doesn't always show up just like you thought it would, if you're not operating in the environment that you're performing in.
No, it makes sense. And I'm wondering if you get any pushback, because I feel like when you enter like a corporate state, like they're like used to having like consulting companies come and like direct change, but I'm unfamiliar with how it works within like military or even like individualized sports, like you said, a swimmer or a golfer. Do they ever like question? They're like, oh, someone from Deloitte or like a consulting background is like helping me with the issues at hand, or is it kind of like a known thing in the sports world?
Yeah, there's probably some gray area to that answer. I think at the core, most people that I have worked with and come across generally just want to be better. They want to be better at whatever they're doing. And, they're willing to have conversations around these topics to help them better understand their own behavior, what's driving some of their behavior, their mindset and perspectives in certain environments. I mean, by the time I'm starting to work with somebody, they're probably pretty advanced in their career. And so they can reflect on what's worked well, what hasn't, what are the stages in their career where they've been on fire, and what are the stages in their career where they've struggled. And so there's a bit of like detachment and perspective to look back and sort of be curious what was going on then, or what were the factors that may have led to me not showing up the way that I expected to. And so there's this sort of curiosity. Um, on the flip side, there's always going to be people who are like, you're a witch doctor. I don't need your help. Why are you talking to me? If I'm even seen talking to somebody that's in the psychology space, it must mean, I'm a whack job. Like, the irony is those are the people that likely could benefit the most from the work because, they're so conflicted. Which we were talking about like overlapping theory before. I'm sure that you all have heard of the stages of change theory, sort of readiness to change, right? Pre-contemplation, contemplation. So most of those folks are like not even in pre-contemplation yet, that are just like, stay away from me. And you're not really going to impact those folks individually anyway at that moment. There typically might need to be sort of a catalyst that for somebody to go from that um, combative to, okay, how can this person help me? Like, you can't help anyone, at least. And it might be different from the IO space because you're working sort of at a higher level a lot of times. But in the individual work that folks in my space do a lot, readiness to change is a huge barrier. And hopefully, like, consultants or psychological experts are aware of where somebody is on that stage of change to help determine how they're going to approach that person. So, it's a common question. Do you get any pushback? Is there confusion? Of course, absolutely. But also, like, let's pretend that we're not immune to pushback from people in industries that are sort of exploring working with us too. How many times do you get pinged on LinkedIn? How many times do people reach out, whether it's marketing or advertising, and the initial gut response is like, oh no, don't want to do that, don't have time for that, don't need that. And you sort of have to say, like, okay, well, let me put that in the save folder and let me go back to that when I'm ready to it. So I don't really see it as different. It's certainly, don't take it personal. But there's plenty of people who are interested in growth and exploration and challenging themselves that don't really have time to worry about anymore the people that are not ready.
It's a really interesting conversation, just like around that whole idea of trying to instill change. Like, I think that I would love to get your perspective on that, Jesse. Like, when trying to like instill change, whether it's on the individual level or the team level, like obviously resistance is usually the first thing that comes to mind. Like, when you are going through those processes, what is kind of like the first thought that comes to your mind of how you could maybe like combat any sort of change?
Yeah. So, was an old professor of mine used to have a very common phrase, and it was just roll with resistance. And I don't think that's it's not rocket science, but it's hard to do in practice because it's so easy to take it personally. Um, so there's something interesting that happens. I don't know if you're familiar with motivational interviewing styles or techniques or tactics, strategies. It comes straight out of that literature, right? Where it's like people that are resisting, um, the worst thing you can do is sort of butt up against them versus like helping them hear what resistance sounds like, and feel how resistance could be getting in their way of getting to where they want to go, and coming at it from more of a curiosity lens. Oh, I don't, I know that you're brought into this organization, but I really don't get it. I think it's a waste of money. I can't believe my partner's putting all this effort and energy into it. It's a bunch of, BS. That's interesting. Why I wonder why your partner would think that it would be worth, investing the time, and I wonder what are some of the benefits that, so like, you're not pushing back saying, oh, you definitely need this, but you're sort of opening up this space to get them to reflect in a subtle way. And eventually, if you're skilled enough, I think you get them to understand, like, oh wow, I don't now I know why I was so hesitant, because I'm the one that really needs this the most, and I'm just not comfortable going to my leadership, talking about some of my struggles, and so this could be beneficial. But certainly, rolling with resistance. There's in some of the the personality literature, and if you look at some of the research around like psychological flexibility, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that concept or that phrase, but there's people that consistently show up as high performers, not only in the workplace but in sport and military, have a high degree of what we would consider psychological flexibility. So there's a ton of research on this space. I'd encourage you to, and anyone else who listens, to dive into this. But there's a few factors that are, sort of core to this idea of psychological flexibility, right? Like willingness to adapt, curiosity, to shift perspectives, openness to new experience, being sort of cognizant of the energy that you have on a daily basis. So to me, it's about like helping folks become less rigid and more flexible in their thinking, opens them up to change, and reduces the wall, I suppose, that they might put up. So at a group level, that becomes infinitely more complex, right? Because you got people and cultures and perspectives and different experiences. So that's why you all are here.
Well, I want to hear more about this psychological flexibility. It sounds interesting. Is it its own psychological personality assessment, or is it integrated in other assessments and it's like almost like a score, like a 1 through 10 sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm sure there are valid and reliable measurements on psychological flexibility. I think about it more as a conversation starter. I encourage people to assess where they are on the scale of, let's say, openness to new experience or curiosity to shift perspectives, willingness to adapt. Like, where would you be 1 to 10? And so it's a common exercise that we do in conversations. But whether it's psychological flexibility, whether it's growth mindset, whether it's grit, whether it's resilience, I mean, there's a lot of overlap in some of these areas. What's true about psychological flexibility is it's it's broad, across like disciplines and industries and dynamics, whereas a lot of the research on growth mindset, right, comes out of the education space. A lot of the research on grit comes out of the education space, some of the military space. But psychological flexibility, is more, I would say, trait specific, whereas growth mindset might be more state specific.
So there's a there's hope for my golf game is what I'm hearing. Is that I might need
That's
to
right.
hire you because I'm not that bad with resistance. So
That's
we'll
right.
have to have you back on. Uh, but no, I like what you're saying about just the performance mindset in general, and I kind of wanted to take a bird's eye view almost because I feel like we dived into it quickly, but one of our like overall questions that we had was how do you even explain performance psychology to someone who's never heard it before, and did we miss kind of anything over the past 15 minutes that that's like really integral to this topic overall?
Yeah. I'll give you my spiel. I'll give you my elevator pitch, as it were, for whether it's potential clients or, just sort of people interested. If you think about the factors that contribute to performance, and you mentioned, my core of my training and education is in the sports psychology space. So for athletes, right, there's sort of three factors that contribute to performance. One is the physical. So how fast are you? How strong are you? How much weight can you move? It's pretty self-explanatory. The second is the technical or tactical. You mentioned golf, right? What is your, symmetry of your putting stroke? Maybe what's your angle of attack on your irons? right? How do you shift your weight on your driver? So the technical aspects of the sport.
Joe's screwed.
And then and then the rest of the stuff, right? The psychosocial emotional mindset, belief systems, managing emotion, dealing with uncertainty, navigating stress, leadership development, communication, understanding the relationship between the mind and body as it shows up in performance, um, focusing on the right things at the right time, developing routines and habits, goal setting, motivation, all the other stuff that is outside of the physical and the technical is where we sit. And the interesting thing is that all the other stuff shows up in both the physical and the technical. So it's always there. Um, the question is, what are you doing about it to train it up? And if you want to leave it up to chance, go for it. If if you want to be deliberate in training up these other areas, this psychological factors that contribute to performance, then there's a whole field and a whole slew of experts that can help you do that. How's that for the
Perfect.
pitch? Okay.
That's I was gonna say it's really interesting. Like I feel like we have to hire you now. Like the when we hear this, Joe and I, we're gonna have to work on all of our different sports that we want to go
That's right.
professional in.
Well, we do. I do a ton of remote work, so and with golfers. So if it tickles your fancy, you have my number. No, well, see, there you go. That's a pretty rigid perspective now, isn't it?
Oh, no, that is right.
Be careful. The words we tell ourselves matter, Joe. I'll be the first one to hold you accountable here. You have the better perspective is I haven't found the right cause yet. I think that gives you it opens the door. Right?
You might have second guesses when you see me in the sand trap this past weekend. It was not pretty old, but I appreciate the
no problem. No problem.
There's something that I want to bring up, and this is more just to my background. I used to coach tennis in the past, and so like I'm hearing a lot of the stuff you're saying, and it's reminding me of just some of the ways that I would try to help my students as a coach, where it was like not just on the court, but it was like applying other psychological ways for them to either feel safe on the court or for them to like have different workarounds when they were struggling mentally, whether that was a notebook or going up to the fence and positively reinforcing themselves. Like, is this kind of similar to the type of work that you're doing? Because that's kind of what I'm picking up.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of overlap. I was a coach myself before I got into this space, so my background's in baseball. I at my core, I'm a coach and an educator. I think any sport coach would if you've tried to coach a sport or a skill, you slowly realize that, or maybe quickly realize that, if you're just hanging out on the technical adjustments, you really have no shot at helping that person get to where they want to go.
100%.
And so yes, there's a ton of overlap on, but I think having sort of the background and let's say you're an expert in sport and performance psychology, being able to integrate those, have that conversation in a way that connects with the athlete is of the utmost importance. Now, in my space, right, I come from the sports psych space. I was dropped into a military environment. I was a contractor. I was not active duty. I've been dropped into a business environment. So for me, I'm going to do all I can to prepare the best I can to be able to speak as good of their language as I can. But I'm never going to pretend to be a soldier or a consultant or a tax partner. I mean, that would be ridiculous, right? I feel like it would be inauthentic and I would lose credibility. So you have to figure out a way, how are you going to bring this stuff that you're supposed to be a subject matter expert on into their space by asking questions, by connecting concepts, right? But yes, there's definitely overlap. And if I may, I'm not the consultant, the performance psych person in me can't leave a dangling carrot out there with your bunker game, Joe. Okay, here we go. You're talking about bringing theory to application. All right, so this goes for anybody that may need help in the sand trap, as it were. So if, let's say, right, I don't know the first thing about your golf game, but when you were describing it, I was thinking like, okay, what are the things that get people into trouble when they get into sand traps, right? They get tense, they're not fluid, they might chunk the ball, they're the angle of attack isn't where it needs to be. It's about feel and touch. And so it reminds me of something that I had a conversation one time with a golfer, and we were trying to figure out like how do you like embody a different space the next time you go on a sand trap. And I said, okay, well, I got a little bit of experience like working in the swimming space. Like, let me go with this for a second. And I said, what's it like sometimes when you're hitting out of the trap? And he goes, well, the best thing I can compare it to is like if you were going to take a dive off a 10-meter board, right? You've seen the Olympics. You know what that is. You take a big dive and then you dive into the water and there's, it's just straight down. I said, well, have you ever watched the Olympics and the 50-meter swimmers where they sort of jump and then they sort of glide through the water and come back up? I want you to think about that with your golf swing, right? About that's the angle of attack versus like I'm a diver and I'm going right down into the sand. Now, I'm not a golf coach. I'm not a swing coach. I don't know the first thing. All I know is that the tension and the stress and the impact of those two visuals and what it takes to sort of glide through the water and come back up was enough to help that person realize like, oh wow, like there's I know what that looks like and I know what that might feel like in my golf swing. And so to sort of bring that energy and that space into my next bunker practice is something I'm going to play around with. Now, you'll never read that in a textbook, but this is sort of like, how do you bring all this stuff together? Because to me, it's like, well, that person's going to be a lot more relaxed. They're going to have a sort of a learning model that's disconnected from their own golf swing, right? I'm going to let my club be a 50-meter swimmer coming off of the block, right? As opposed to a diver. So it's impersonal, right? There's less ego attached because you're trying something new. So like all these theories that you're bringing into this like technique and strategy to try and go practice. And we'll see what happens. So there you go.
That's amazing the way you put it. I like the way you put it, especially when the word golf, because I feel like a lot of people who play golf know it's a lot about the mental too. It's you get up there and you go to swing and you see with so many people and they just mess it up and it's like, oh, I was thinking of too many things at once. But the way you described it and picturing it in a different experience that you're maybe more used to and applying it to that. I remember someone told me once, when you're in the sand trap, picture like a single dollar bill, and you want to hit like before and after it, and kind of there's more to it, but there was like a one fluid motion, kind of like going into the dive and then coming back up. And it did help because you're right. It almost takes like some of the stress off of it because you're not even really doing a sand shot anymore, but you're doing something else while doing your wet shot. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, but I appreciate the hints. It's I'm going to keep rambling on about golf. Maybe we could talk about it after.
Well, but I want to add something, actually. I want to add something. And it's kind of funny that you say all this. Joe was playing golf, and then a couple of our buddies, I went to play golf with them at Top Golf earlier this weekend. And we started off, and like my head kept popping up. I was missing a bunch of shots. And it was like I was trying to just hit the crap out of the ball, hit it as far as I could. And I kept missing. But then at Top Golf, they have this thing where it's like you can play Angry Birds.
Yeah.
But it's like with the golf ball.
I've played that with my 5-year-old there. It's great.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Us graduate students love it too. And so we were going. And the second it changed to Angry Birds, I started kicking everyone's butts because I wasn't thinking about the shot.
That's amazing.
I was just thinking about hitting the ball where I needed to hit it. And I think that's like almost another real life example of kind of what you were speaking to there.
It's a great example because it also it brings to mind like as somebody that comes from the sport psychology space, it's really like what you just described is sort of what we would call implicit learning. Like it's not explicit, go do this with the angle of attack, but like go figure out how to hit the bird off the house, and your body's going to like self-organize to figure out how to do that. And so it's in the sports psych space, and I'd be curious to know if there's any comparison. But to be what I would consider a quality sports psychology professional, you really have to have some understanding of not only the psychological aspects of performance, but you need to understand biomechanics. You need to understand kinesiology. You need to understand exercise science. You need to understand communication strategies, leadership. You need to understand a bit about like the psychoneuromuscular system. You need to understand like learning theory. There's all these other aspects outside of just psychology that you really need to figure out, because there's so much at play. And when you're thinking about IO, like, it's so fascinating because the performer, like the organism, is the organization. Like, it's sort of this dynamic, shifting, changing structure that looks different every day because there's so many inputs, and there's just, it's so complex. And so y'all have a tough gig. So I'm glad you get paid the big bucks. Somebody's
We're starting an
got to do
IO
it.
firm right now.
That's
I
right.
feel like the closest thing we get to that side is maybe through like research on stress. Like I remember we learned in like an org class about like not even, I don't even want to say biology, but some like biological responses that the body has due to stress. But it is cool hearing from the sports side that like you guys really go into the kinesiology and like the bodily functions, and then you incorporate it with those sorts of
Right,
things.
because if you're trying to let's say you're trying to learn a new anything, swim stroke, golf stroke, shooting stroke in basketball, and you're learning, your body is learning and adapting and developing like neuromuscular connections under a certain environment, let's say a stress-free environment, and then you drop yourself into a high stress environment. All of a sudden, you haven't trained your body and your brain and your physiological system to operate in that different environment. People are like, well, I'm great in practice, but I go into competition and I crap the bed. It's like, well, you haven't trained in the right environments. You're not creating the systems and processes that you need to be able to call on automatically, right, in those tougher environments.
Well, that was great. I think we probably have to ask our last question before we, because I know both Brandon and I probably have tons of questions for you.
Yeah, we can keep
Maybe
going.
off the recording. Half of them probably about my golf game still, but it's okay. But the question that we ask all our guests to end off the recording: do you have any bits of advice just for incoming students that are trying to get into this sort of space?
Man, a ton of advice. The first advice is just listen to as many podcasts like this from people that are doing the work as possible, and be able to filter through the BS as best you can. Do your homework as a student and as an incoming student to try and filter through the stuff that isn't valid and may not be reliable. The other thing is, like, take your time. Like, when you're a student, be a student. When you're an early career professional, be an early career professional. Um, I've seen too many situations where people try to move too fast and they're not ready, and it really impacts their career. It impacts their ability to network. They are so quick to want the next opportunity or the next meeting or the next promotion, and they're not ready for it, and they just fall flat. And that could show up as, I have people that reach out to me that are curious about the space that are clearly unprepared to have the conversation. That's a data point for me. It's not the end all be all, but certainly, like, that's an opportunity to connect with somebody in the field, that it's a way to make an impact, for better for worse. Then there's people who, for some way or another, might get an opportunity that they wouldn't otherwise be ready for, and unfortunately it shows up at the point of attack. So I would just say, like, be where your feet are. Know that as much as you see stuff on social media and all the great things people are doing, you don't need to do that. You need to be where you are right now, and you need to, in the sports psych space, what we tell students is, if you're going out and you're working with middle school tennis players as a sport, and that's your first exposure, go be the best middle school sports psychology consultant in the history of the world, and do that really well first, and then you can go on to high school, and then you can go on to D3 or to D1. But just be appreciative of where your feet are. Know that your story is your own, and you don't need to try and be where anyone else is.
I think that's that's some really unique advice that I think we've had on here before, or that we have not had on here before. Really being present in that moment of like where you're at in your career and understanding like the trajectory for yourself is something that I think students and early career professionals should really look into, because we do really sometimes get focused on either what other people are doing or what we could be doing. and you still have to focus on what you are currently doing right now. And I think, Jesse, that's like a really good point for students and people who are like early on to think about and to keep on the top of their mind. Because if I always am thinking with that end goal in mind, I'm going to forget about everything that I was supposed to be focused on right now. And then you miss it too. Like all of the great learnings that can come from the work that you're doing, whether that's in graduate school or that's in your first year, like straight out of graduate school, or even at any point in your career, if you're focusing only on what's coming later, you miss everything that you're doing right now. And then where does the learning come in, and how do you grow and how do you change? I think that's awesome advice to hear. I really like that.
Yeah. And last thing, I know we got to go. If you ask people who are successful in your field, let's say they're 5, 10, 20, 25 years in, who are doing what you want to do, if you ask them, could you have predicted your career path if you look back? I would put my mortgage on it that 99.9% of them would say I would have never been able to predict how I got here from where I started. And when you try to fabricate that without all the information, you can't jump the curve successfully. You just can't. You need to go through the stuff every day to have success and have an impact. So, with that, Godspeed. Congratulations to all the upcoming graduates and recent graduates. I know you two are on the verge here of being real life human beings outside of
Very soon.
grad school. So,
When this comes
you
out, we'll
know,
be graduated.
there you go. There you go. So, good luck.
Yeah. Thank you, Jesse, for joining us. It's going to be an awesome episode for people to listen to.
Thank you so much for coming on.
You bet. Thanks.
That was a really fun episode, Joe. Really good timing after we heard that talk at PsyOp about the intersection of sports psychology and the business practice. I'm really interested to see, like, kind of, I guess, one, how good your golf game gets after this, and then also like where we can maybe find some of that intersection as well, and what we can do with our careers from what we learned today.
It was cool because he said a lot of IO psychology things from a non-traditional IO psychology like background. And honestly, another thing I wish we could have asked him that I'm just thinking about now is that he had a master's in counseling. I wonder how much
Oh,
of that
oh yeah.
puts in his work. I know it's not like we had the time, but it was a really really cool episode.
Yeah, I know that like we both are very interested by this stuff, and I really hope that people listen to this episode and hear, just because it's not IO psychology doesn't mean it can't be IO related, and they can kind of pick out, like, I thought every single piece of what he had to say there was something that we could use on a daily basis when applying it to motivation or engagement or performance, like all things that IO psychology stands to like help improve.
Yeah, hopefully we could have more people on from a non-IO psych background to hear how those principles work in their environment that they may or like may not be aware of. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe stay tuned. We'll see what happens in the future. But thank you everybody as always for listening. We'll catch you next week.